Cool. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Svelte and Sveltekit. And this definitely can be, it's a relatively short presentation. We're going to spend about an hour, but we can cover a bunch of areas. Hell, you haven't heard my things. We've done in previous meetups, we've done like 7 lines of code in the compiler for V8 in an hour. So this is good. So look, the deal is I want to talk about Svelte and I want to talk about Sveltekit and how these two fit together. There's some confusion around them to begin with. I want to talk about some of the positives, some of the differences in how Svelte works, how Sveltekit works. And we'll put it in the context of some things that I've done over time. But a lot of it is I want to draw a little bit of a difference between the programming model, how it looks, how it feels, what you're trying to do, and maybe just a difference in philosophy. I was saying earlier, for anyone who maybe heard my previous diatribes, that's probably a good word for them while we were talking, is that Svelte is like the polar opposite of what React is trying to be. Okay, they're opposite. Now, it doesn't mean, by the way, it solves all the problems. It means it drags a whole bunch of new problems in a different direction when it does this. But for certain things, it's very interesting. We were talking a little bit earlier about web components, and actually that was actually my bridge to Svelte. Is I was trying to do more web component stuff, and Svelte actually does a pretty good job of being able to let you produce web components if you want to. And the reason that it works is that it's fairly lightweight and fairly composable. Unlike some of the stuff, and I spent eons trying to do this properly in React, of trying to get things to lazy load and things to come up, it's challenging. And one of the reasons it's always challenging is that there's so much framework code that's kind of in React and has to run to begin with, that when you're lazy loading, to your point about Webpack, you're having to do things where you're like, oh, no, when this compiles, try to exclude all of this stuff that's already over here because I only want to bring this in, but then it has to run on top of here. But what happens if I'm on 2 slightly different dot releases of React when I'm trying to bring something in or out, or how does that match up, or what ends up happening? And for those of you who've been around a long time, like me, because I'm ancient, this is a problem that we've seen over and over again. Back to the Flash and Flex and all these frameworks, they got to a certain point where everything worked, and then they're like, oh shit, we've got this small problem where like now you have 2 versions, and what do you do? And everyone's tried to solve it a lot of different ways. Where Svelte is kind of different here is that it's not saying everything disappears, but a lot of the framework disappears because it's compiled. Okay. And so as opposed to having it, oh, big old asterisk, I plan on lying a lot. Okay. We're cool with that. Yeah. Look, here's the deal. In an hour, no matter what I do, we can't possibly cover like the depths of what's really happening, but we can get conceptual models for what's happening. So when I kind of speak to some of these things and I'm like, well, this is compiled versus interpreted or this or that, it's because I want to give you a conceptual model for how it works, even if it doesn't mean it's literally accurate in every way, right? But one of the best ways to think about it, in my opinion, in this way is that you can think of React as almost an interpreted language. React is basically a bunch of functions that project and are interpreted by a framework. That interpretation is then diffed, presented out, we patch a UI based on it. It's kind of interpreted, right? Instead, Svelte is statically analyzed and compiled, where as opposed to the idea of saying, well, we'll see what changed and then we'll figure out what node updated, Svelte has done a lot of that work at compile time where it knows if this property changes, I know I'm going to be updating that node in the UI. So that stuff's been pre-done at compile time, which can make it extremely fast. It can make it extremely lightweight because as opposed to all that framework code, which had to do the diffing and interpretation, it's all gone because it happened at compile time. Trick, little small caveats. That makes it really, really hard to debug sometimes. Because the inner workings of what you look at or try to set a breakpoint in if you're in a Svelte file, don't ever expect that you can set a breakpoint inside of there and make heads or tails of what actually was happening, not without a lot of work. Now, there's ways around it. You can try to keep things in external files. You can do a lot of stuff to help yourself out, but it does come at a price. It's pretty cool in a lot of ways, but it comes at a price. Also, it's very common in Svelte to run kind of in a dev mode, but to do builds, maybe more for a production mode. And even though it's not supposed to, I've definitely run into issues where I see one thing kind of in dev and then some new problems emerge when we get into sort of a more of a production build. So look, it's relatively new comparatively still. I know there are a few versions in, but it's still relatively new as a piece. Also, which we'll talk about at length, is Sveltekit. Well, maybe at length. We'll see how far we get. Sveltekit was confusing to me because when I first started looking at this, I'm like, oh, SvelteKit must be like the React starter app of like how you do Svelte. It turns out they have nothing. Like that's not what's going on at all. SvelteKit is basically a new version or a new idea on how we might produce mixed mode client and server applications where some things happen on the client and some things happen on the server. And a lot of that is transparent to the developer who wrote it. And that's, again, really, really interesting, but takes a little bit to get your head around, a little bit harder to debug sometimes, figuring out where things are at, where you want to go, how things are going to come together. Certainly not the React starter app, by the way, of how you want to get into things. And it has, despite the advertisements of everything that's out there, there are some compatibility problems with existing libraries. There's challenges. So again, SvelteKit, very cool, but SvelteKit, the basic analogy here is SvelteKit is the idea of producing large apps that are somehow mixed between static content and dynamic content. So entire things that might be some part server, some part client. Svelte, again, this is one of those little bit of lies, but Svelte is closer to the component framework side of things, where with a sufficiently complex set of components, you can build an app, but the Svelte side is more about the components. It's more about you're building pieces and modules and tight little pieces that will eventually compile the JavaScript, okay? So we'll continue to draw distinctions between those as we go along and as we do things. But that whole part about what's being compiled and what's actually being done at runtime is tricky and is interesting because, as I was also mentioning earlier, it does make other things harder, and some easier. Don't want to take away from it, but some things harder because in React you can just be like, it's cool. I'm just gonna go ahead and return a function that's going to look up some global variable and figure this out. And I don't even need to know the name of the variable yet. I'll pull it out of some string that happens to be in the URL. And then I'm going to go grab this thing and I'll evaluate it. And maybe it won't be there. So I'll OR it with an empty object and everything's going to be fine. It'll be great. Okay, that is not the Svelte world. Because the Svelte world is, it wanted to figure out when you change a property in the URL, what 3 parts of the UI do I have to update? So it needs to understand all of those pathways statically during compilation time. And that means your ability to do maybe sometimes arguably bad, but either way, very dynamic things is somewhat impinged by the way that Svelte works. Okay? All right. Other things that for me were very tricky is that we actually need to get out of the mindset that React has spent a lot of time getting us into, which is the idea that there is this sort of like memoization layer and things that we have to worry about. Memoization is a really, really important piece of React in general because of the fact that React is going to try to re-render the screen as a constant. And although it is not that way anymore and it hasn't been for quite some time, the original idea of React was that you take data, you apply a function to it, you get UI. It was supposed to be a projection function. That was slow. So over time, things have kind of changed a little bit where we have areas where we can do things that are more localized, subscription mechanized, localized updates. Used to be very early in React, by the way, you could quite literally step through the code and you would see like, oh, look, it's patching the DOM. You don't see that anymore because it's done a lot of stuff that's harder. But because these render cycles happen over and over again, it's really, really important to memoize and to keep state in very specific ways in React because we want to make sure that other parts of the DOM don't accidentally rerun, right? And it's not even so much a render. We don't want it to modify. We don't want it to change. That proposition, again, is very different in a language where we're talking about declaring things up front, which ultimately get projected out to the UI by a process that's more compilation oriented. So to me, where I find Svelte a little trickier is you almost have to do a little bit more pre-planning to get things right. It's a little bit more declarative, a little bit more thought that goes into it up front. It was easier for me to jump into React and start hacking at something and see what shows up and then change something, change something, change something. But ultimately, if I take the time to do things, I can produce things in Svelte that run way lighter and way easier. And the place that I see it most relevant and most interesting is on mobile and smaller devices. If I do something that I want to target to a device, I can definitely do those and I can get incredibly good performance out of a Svelte app on even a relatively low-end device. And that's really cool. Again, like everything, there's trade-offs. There's penalties between it, okay? Joe Matalone? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I'm just talking about. So the question was, is that did I mean browser based? But yeah, what I'm just mean is like even if I did like a PWA or progressive web app or something on mobile, it performs pretty damn well, to be completely honest, and even on older devices. I don't have as many as I used to, but at Digital Primates, we used to have this cadre of like device lab of all our older devices that try everything on. And so I kept a couple of them. And so even on some of these older devices, um, it runs relatively well. All right, so let's talk about the structure of Svelte first. And again, we're going to move back and forth between Sveltekit and Svelte a little fluidly at times, but we're going to start on the Svelte side, okay? So a Svelte file is this. Now, real quick up front, behind the scenes, Svelte is doing compilation. So I'm running in its sort of a dev mode. It's using Vite for some compilation. There's things happening. You can author fairly natively in TypeScript or in JavaScript native. What happens when you're creating a Svelte file, and there's really going to be several types of files that go into this. The .svelte extension are basically your Svelte components. They can import and use everything else, every other sort of JavaScript or TypeScript file on the planet, but your core files are these Svelte files that are compiled. Svelte files themselves have a VS Code plugin that most of the time works. Don't try to refactor with it. Just warning you up front, if you're ever in a big Svelte project and you're like, you know what I should do? I should refactor this, commit everything to Git, and then take a copy of all that and keep it on 3 other machines, and then consider refactoring. So generally, we see a couple things in a Svelte file. We see a script tag up top, and we can denote a language. So in this case, we're saying we're doing TypeScript, okay? And we generally have something that looks a lot like HTML elements below, which is really a template syntax. It's a lot closer and more familiar to those people who might have worked or have come from any of the multitude of languages that use templates before. Okay, so it looks a little bit more like a template syntax where we can execute things in. Now, for context, as a lot of people do, I have a site that I build over and over and over again in like 1.5 million different languages and deploy. And so this site was my latest deployment. This is the version of it here. Let me go back here for a second. So I hold a couple wine certifications because I needed something else to do. And and so I have this site out here that is basically, I don't know, it's a massive site that's about wine and spirits education. And it has all these sorts of wines and things that you can go into, and it has everything that's driven, and there's graphs and data that comes from it. And what's really interesting is behind the scenes, this is all actually driven by Markdown. So this is just a whole set of Markdown that I analyzed the Markdown and projected out to these sorts of views. So what's neat is that I can take a bunch of people who don't really know anything about technology. I have a bunch of folks that work with me, and they just modify Markdown. And in the course of them just saying like, hey, here's what's going on, these graphs project out, everything just kind of changes from the Markdown. So this has about 3,800 pages plus that kind of generate for it automatically that come out of it. And I recently ported it all to Sveltekit and Svelte. Was an adventure. There were some good things about it, but it was an adventure. One of the things that's interesting about it that we decided to use as an example for today is this thing I call learn mode. And that is one of the cool things is that since all this content is in Markdown, I can invert it all, which is that I can analyze the content and in fact generate questions out of it and make a quiz mode for people who come to it by just inverting the purpose of the content and asking people questions about it. So there's this quiz mode that works through, and we can go ahead and without looking at stuff, I'll just answer, and we can tell that we did a terrible job, and we get sort of information about what's going on. So this little component makes a nice little piece because it encapsulates a lot of things that are in Svelte. It encapsulates the idea of some form of reactivity, how we update local data, how we might render things to the screen. So we're going to build a little version of this one and then talk about how we would integrate it into Sveltekit as we move along, okay? So let's do that. All right, so as a starting point, what we're going to do here is I just have some data. I grabbed a chunk of data out of a network capture of that data that would be driving that other screen. And we'll look at it. So again, we're just in TypeScript here. But the interesting thing, again, is that we get with Svelte a lot of things that are inferred and capable because of the fact that it's hooked into the compiler, right? So it's aware of the type of this thing. It knows that data in this case has a certain shape. I can use those things. It will, in fact, do compile time checking if I'm trying to use things that aren't there. So you do get actually a pretty nice developer experience around the idea of, are you screwing up badly? at least in terms of those things. Now, what I'm going to do in general here is that we're going to use that data and we're going to talk about projecting it out to a view. Now, here, we're going to use just view elements that we would do, and they're going to look a lot more like HTML. Absolutely. Yes. It's okay. Fortunately, we haven't gotten very far yet. The better?
Yeah, that's been direct feed at least.
Okay. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about Svelte and Sveltekit. Now the major all right. So yeah. Oh, good. Mm-hmm. I usually start and end there. It is kind of how it works. And to be fair, the number of bottles of wine consumed while writing this site may have impeded its progress. All right, so let's talk about how we would, every once in a while I catch that echo, so just stick with me for a second. All right, let's talk about how we would actually look at something like this in Svelte. We see we have a data structure here, and so as a very first thing, we just want to go ahead and build out something. So we have a div as a starting point. Now, again, we're just going to create something that looks like a relatively static structure of HTML. So we'll say in this case, going along with that quiz mode, let's see if I can type it. My W key doesn't want to work. Okay, that's going to be a problem typing wine a lot if my W key doesn't work. You know, which of these wines is most likely to be, all right, and now we got just this set of brackets, which are a form of data binding, but in a compiled sense, which means they're going to evaluate an expression. So in this case, I'm going to say data dot topic dot range expression. So I'm just going to pull something from this piece of data. But there's a couple of interesting things to see here. It's very JavaScripty in the sense that it's just a variable. It's just it's constant in this case. It's just a constant. It's just some data on the screen. And we're going to see that that is one of the things that Rich Harris, who's behind this, talks about a lot. And I get his opinion, but that in general, what they were trying to go for with Svelte is that people have moved away from core JavaScript things like let and variables and setting variables, and they had to move towards something that looked a lot more like thinking about the mechanism of setting state and updating state and getting state. And he was trying to get back to the point of just saying like, no, let's use JavaScript, right? Let's use let's use const, let's use those sorts of things. So in this case, what we're going to do here as a starting point is we're going to see that a lot of things are going to look pretty straightforward and pretty JavaScript-y, if you will. And when we do that, you know, we're going to update and we're going to see that there's some variable replacement or something that happened in here. Now, much like any other template language, but what you have to understand here is that things are kind of compiling as we go, right? Like there's analysis, there's things that's happening. And that's really important because what just happened here is that in this case, it's a constant, so it does know it's not going to change. But if this was a variable, this little chunk of DOM is now sort of intimately tied to that sort of variable if it was a let, where that sort of update knows it has to update this DOM node. And at its core, at its very smallest sense, and again, there's a lot more complexity than this, but we're going to use this as a mental model. What we're really saying is that we know that an update to that has to update this DOM node. And so instead of doing diffs, instead of trying to figure out what changed, we can sort of know in advance in a more applicative way of saying like, yeah, that has to change because this changed. And that's where some of the speed and the power begins to come through, is that ability to do static code analysis on what's actually, and code analysis, static and otherwise, on what's actually happening here. Okay, so those two things are sort of brought together as a starting point. Now, we can do other sorts of expressions in here. And by the way, I will let you know up front that some of the syntax, I look up like 23 times a day. Was it? Yeah, exactly right. But even worse in some ways, because like there's a couple things that just don't resonate in my head. Like whether an if starts with a colon or whether it's the else, like you're going to watch me type it wrong 12 times. I promise you I can make the code work, but I'm going to type it wrong. So just let's all understand each other up front, okay? All right, so in this case, what we're going to say is that we wanted to sort of iterate through and I wanted to display the options. But in my data here, really there's the topic, which is the right answer, and there's some distractors. So we need to make something that's going to work. We're going to make a variable and we'll call it options for now. And options is just going to be an array which will include, no, it's going to include the topic, and then it's going to include those distractors that I have above. And it doesn't want to code complete for me, maybe because I'm spelling it wrong, but that's okay. All right, so it's going to include those distractors. And then for now, we'll just do a little sort on it to something like 0.5 minus math.random. Okay, so that'll give us a random enough sort for what we're trying to do. Okay, so there's our options. And so we're going to say we're going to do something for each option. Now, we can do any sorts of expressions in here, which means we can destructure here just like we could in other sorts of things, right? So as a starting point, we could destructure out here and say, okay, well, I want the ID and the title of what was pulled out. Like React, it's sometimes useful to know what the key of a loop is so that we can understand what to update. So this is their expression. I'm looking up here, but it's down here. This is their expression to basically say that, which is, okay, we've got a ID is going to be the kind of key of this loop indicator. So we can reuse something, et cetera. That's what the thing we're trying to actually update. Okay, so as a starting point, oh, I know what I did wrong. See, I'm a dummy. That's the problem. Yeah, well, see, look, really, these are the sorts of things a compiler should be telling me, and not the other way around. So I blame the tooling. All right, so as a starting point, we have some options. We're going to loop over them, and we'll just do something relatively dumb for right now. We'll just do something like saying that we have a button for each of these, right? Button for each, and for our buttons, we'll put the title inside, and that's probably good enough for our starting point. Okay, so now we've basically got a loop. We've got something that's kind of going on here. If we wanted to be a little smarter about this, just to make it a little less awful, like 1%, we're not going to spend any time on styling, by the way. However, that does lead me to talk about something. One of the things you get with Svelte right off the bat is scope styling. So I can define styles in this file, and the styles in this file are scoped to this component. So that is that promise of web components that we've heard over and over again. And of course, they're doing it in different ways, but styles are scoped. They're local. They're supposed to be scoped to a component so that they aren't really shared in general. You can share them. You can still import CSS and have global styles, and you'll see me later. I've done that here. But in general, any styles that I define in this component are local to this component, and they won't interfere with other components, okay, that we build out. Okay, so we have some styles and we have some pieces here, and that's it. That's the whole app. Fantastic, huh? All right, so this is all good, and that maybe gives us a little something to start with, but what we really have here is we've rendered some things on the screen. We don't have a lot in terms of interactivity. So one of the first things we probably need to do is handle some form of click or selection on a button, okay? So in Svelte, what you'll see here is this is the way that we handle events. Now, this is going to be really familiar to people who came to things before React and really not familiar to people who came to it with React. React's mechanism for doing this is we always pass a function in that can be invoked. Here, we actually dispatch events. Events are dispatched. They can be handled by an exterior entity, okay? So all events start with this on keyword. You can define your own custom events, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in this case, we're just going to say on click, okay? On click operator is going to allow us to call a function. So because of the fact that Joe says every presentation I do is a Trojan horse for functional programming, that was a literal quote. I'll go ahead and do something with at least a higher order function once here so that you can feel a little better about it. So we'll do something like toSelection handler or toSelection. And we'll take an ID, and then we're going to return a function, which will later take an event. And what that's going to allow me to do is basically say that on every click, I can pass in something that's going to take the ID. Okay, so every one of these functions now will be aware of its ID. Once it actually gets passed in, we can actually do something with that ID. Now, in the simplest form of what we might do, and we're not actually going to use much about this right now, so we'll leave that here. In the simplest form of what we could do now is we could really figure out if something's right or wrong by comparing it. So we could say something along the lines of like, is it correct? Is it this? And we'd really know that by if the ID they selected was the one in the topic. And that's cool, and we can make that work, but it's certainly not going to show us a lot of visible side effect right now because we don't have any way to handle that. So let's actually play with that for a moment. All right, so the next thing we'll actually do instead is that we'll come down here and we'll make just a little bit of UI presence. Now you'll notice that what I didn't just do was create a fragment. I didn't have to go create a fragment in order to have two things at the same level or some variation there in between. I can just, for instance, put a couple of divs together in terms of something that I'm going to put out here. So I'll say that our current score, and I'm going to need to bind to something. Okay, well, what's that going to be? Well, for right now, we'll call it score. And what's that going to be? Well, we're just going to say we are going to do let score equals 0 because it's a variable and a variable is viable. And the moment that I've defined this variable as a let, it understands that if I update that score, that line of code should change and update. All right, so as a starting point, what we're going to say is something in here that'll be pretty basic to begin with. We'll do something like say, well, what we're going to do is our score will be, that's not how you spell score. Our score will be equal to something that's going to be based on this difficulty. Okay, so we'll say data.difficulty, but we shouldn't always go up in points. Sometimes we should go down in points. So we're going to do that and we'll multiply it by something like this. We'll say if the ID that we happen to get is equal to the right one, then we'll multiply it by 1. Else we're going to multiply it by -1. Okay. Get that there. Okay. So now what we're doing in this particular case is that we're updating something rather directly here. Yeah, well, there you go. Look at that, telling me what I should have done. So we have a basic sense here now where we have a current score, and if we click the right or wrong things, we should see the score update and sort of change as we go along. All right, cool enough, works, great. We know how to sort of do those things. There's only one direction right now, so maybe that's kind of slightly problematic in terms of what's going on, and we certainly don't get a whole lot of feedback other than that. So we could do more with that. What we'll do now is that we'll say, great, it's fantastic that we actually have this data, but we want some explanation of why something went right or wrong. So we're going to do some more little sort of inline things here. We're going to say if, and the reason I actually was looking down there is because I always get the if wrong. So now it's my kryptonite in this frickin' language. All right, so if we got it right, well, how are we going to do that? Well, for right now, let's go ahead maybe, and we'll say that we're going to capture what the selected ID is. Now, maybe that's a crappy way to go forward, but we're going to do it for right now, and we'll say, okay, we're going to keep our selected ID here. Okay, and if our selected ID is true, well, then we know that they've made a selection. Okay, and so if that selection has been made, then we can do some other things. In this case, we're going to put out a list, and then inside of that list, we'll do another each loop. And in this case, what we're going to do again is we'll go through each of those options. And this time, we're going to maybe get a little bit more information out of it. So I'd like that ID again. We'll get a title. We'll get a URL at least, and maybe, and that range expression. And I'll show you how that's going to work. Again, we're going to go ahead and say, hey, use that ID as a way to go ahead and indicate what row or what place we're on, and we'll just build a little quick list. Okay. No. Thank you, IDE. All right, so what we'll do in here is we'll bind to our URL. And if you'll notice, these are all scoped, right? So that URL is scoped into here, just like you would expect in sort of a JavaScript function. We do a title, and we'll say is generally, and we'll make some italics, and we'll put our range expression. Okay, so what that's going to say now is that after we click one, it's going to be like, well, this is generally dry. This one would have generally been this. And as I'm, clicking through things, I'm getting a little feedback about what's happening. Okay, so that's all good. We're able to kind of get things back and forth. And it also gives us an opportunity to look at some side effects and other things that can happen. Use effect, things like that, we're used to sort of seeing, and that's one way to handle things here. But Svelte side effects can be reactive, okay? And what we mean by that is that we can do these sorts of reactive statements. And reactive statements are the type of things that do some work. So here we could say console.log score. Now, this is pretty interesting because this is just a side effect that's going to log out score. It's something that's reactive. But what's pretty cool about it is what's actually happening here. Unlike a scenario where we said like use effect and we declared the dependencies that we intended to watch and we used a linter to make sure that the dependencies we put into the list with the use effect were probably the right ones so that we didn't get caught in some weird closure state where things were going to fail unexpectedly and we'd have the wrong variable. Instead, we said, right, or ignore them all just to make sure you get the wrong closure state. Here we said score. And in doing so, it understands that just like every other part, this reactive expression needs to be rerun anytime that score changes. So every time we do something, it does it. Chill, Matt, alone. You had a question? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Right. Prior to this, once it's compiled, before you did this that you're doing right, they throw away everything it does. Like, why wouldn't it just like render the list and be like, I don't need to watch this data or need it at all? Well, in this case, actually, so the question, I'm going to broadly say the question was about when things are reactivity, when things are watched, when they're not. In this particular case, it knows that this div only needed to care if score was updated. It didn't need to know anything else. The other things were a constant. So in fact, it never actually needed to watch this or change it at all. This didn't need to change unless options changed, which only changes in the beginning here right now, but we might change it later when it gets sorted differently or on some sort of reform. So it really is doing that sort of analysis of what is actually possible to change. And if it's possible to change, I should pay attention to it. And if it's not possible to change, I can ignore it.
It makes that distinction on page load on what,
Most of it's done at compile time.
I mean, before page load.
Right.
Basically a prepackaged box.
Correct.
Hand to somebody and then they know what's in the box.
Yep. And so since basically everything is statically defined in that capacity, we can know already how and what needs to update as a result. Mm-hmm.
You've defined option above based on.
Yep. Correct. We're done. There's nothing more that has to happen there. Right. Okay. So the idea is, again, is to keep it lightweight, is to only, let's call it decorate, but that's a little bit in quotes here, but we only have to decorate what we actually care about to that degree. Okay. And even these sorts of things with the reactive part, which isn't on your screen, but is yours. Okay. Even like that log statement really are just going to compile down to a function that are invoked when score changes. That's what that really becomes.
So to kind of contrast this, these are like computed in view, except those are runtime.
Right.
Where this is all.
And that's the thing I kind of say again with a lot of this is it's really the difference somewhat between interpretation and compilation, right? It's that same sort of idea. By the way, these can return, I'm using it purely for a side effect here, but you can actually use these as an expression and assign the result to a variable that you can also use. So you can actually return a result to a variable that's computed out of a function or something of the sort as well. Okay,
So you could have like a score form at the bottom.
for sure. Okay. All right, so in this case, we would be logging things out every time the score changed. We'd shoot something to the screen. What's important to understand is that, and again, the other side of this is that I could actually have a variable like foo, that's not how you spell foo, which would be the result of doing something like this if console log was returning something of use there, which now that would be updated every time score changed. Okay. And we're going to get a little bit more into subscriptions and stores in a bit here, but that's just kind of a quick view or a quick idea of what's actually happening there in order to make things work. All right, so we've got a score. We have the ability to click through some different things and see the result in terms of what's happening, and that's fine. But it's only showing this little bit of reactivity. And certainly, even if I go through and do a whole bunch of things like this and hit refresh, those are all going to go away because I'm only transiently storing them in a variable right now. Okay, there's no more to it than that. So we can do a little bit more here as far as what we're doing, and obviously we could do other fancy if statements and change things as we go along, but we're starting with something relatively simple. We might want to do something in here, just a starting point, saying, well, hey, if the thing was selected, maybe before we actually put out that list, we tell them real quick. So we'll do this real fast because this will help us in a moment. If it just so happens that that selected ID is in fact equal to the real ID, then maybe come back here. Maybe we want to tell them that it's correct. So we'll do our fancy bold tag, correct. Maybe we want to do an else statement here. I'll probably get this wrong. Look at me get it right. All right, and then we'll just say wrong, Joe, W key, wrong, in terms of what actually happened. So now we get some sense of saying wrong, correct, which is at least good because we can see something changing on the screen as we're doing something. Okay, pretty basic stuff so far. This is communication between inner one piece, but then we have to start talking about how communication happens between pieces. What do we do? And we use a version, or we basically end up using very similar JavaScript syntax for this, is that we can actually have exported variables. So we could have something, well, we won't call it data right now, but we could have something like that, which would allow us to have a variable that's exposed to the outside world, data that's allowed to pass into us, kind of like a prop, okay? And there's some reverse stuff that we're not going to get into where you can bind to those variables and do some other hellish things. But in general, we'll kind of talk about it from that perspective. So this gives us an opportunity then to kind of start realizing how we might want to handle things over the course of time. For example, here, we certainly don't want to store everything locally. And here, maybe we want to do some form of local storage, is what I think we're going to play with in a moment here. But we can store some value. We can react to values from the outside world, and we're going to kind of play with all of those pieces, because that's where the power of this really comes in. Now, this brings up the differences between things, a bunch of things. Contexts. I want to talk about those first, and just as a quick allusion to them. Svelte has context just like React has context. They don't do the same thing. So when you go to look them up, don't expect them to do the same thing, because they're not going to. Cool. Contexts in Svelte are purely a way of distributing data to hierarchical nodes underneath a given point. That part's the same as React. The difference is that there is nothing reactive about contexts inherently. They're just basically an object provided to things. So there's nothing that monitors those changes or those changes over time. You have to choose to do those things. And the way that we choose to do those things at runtime, if we have something that is actually runtime capable, and if you refer back to all the things I've been talking about, I've been saying, hey, everything's code, static code analysis. So what if something really does change at runtime and we want to monitor something at runtime? That's a concept of what stores and these sorts of reactive things are in Svelte. Okay, stores are basically the type of thing that are or can be subscribed to. In fact, interestingly, anything that has a subscribe method that follows the same signature can be subscribed to in Svelte. So you could write yourself an RxJS version of these or something else, or you can use a Svelte store. Doesn't much matter. They just have a very simple interface, which is that you can subscribe to it and that the subscription returns something to allow unsubscription. Okay, as long as that interface is followed, you can kind of do whatever you want with them. So we can play with that and kind of bridge this thing into a little bit of a store or something else that we could do here in order to make it all work. And so in my vision of the world here, score is kind of something that aggregates over time. It wouldn't really be something of a question, right? So it probably doesn't belong necessarily in this component. It probably belongs outside of it. Probably something that should be persisted over time. And maybe there's multiple areas of the application that might want to know the score as opposed to just this one component. So that's the type of thing that means it probably doesn't belong in here. Okay. Now we get to the idea of cross-component communication. As we already saw with our button, when we wanted to communicate from a parent to a child, from a child to a parent, we generally used events. And this goes to an old adage from a long time ago, which is events up, props down. Okay, so events inform people above you, props should be passed down to provide data to people below you. So we're kind of back to that scenario. It's only been 10 years, it makes sense. Get very cynical as you've been doing this for enough time. All right, so we can have a little bit of fun with that real quickly. I'm going to collapse up this data just because we don't need to keep seeing it for right now. But what we can do here is that we can create something like a dispatcher and create event dispatcher. Okay, So create event dispatcher. May have just imported the wrong one on me here. By the way, this is a fun thing that does occasionally happen, is that VS Code likes to import things. And it's not the thing I wanted it to import. All right. But hey, that's part of the fun. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with the create event dispatcher. Now, an event dispatcher is the type of thing that's just a function, but it's more than a function, because when I have an event dispatcher, it's going to inform Svelte about the types of things I can listen to for events, and we're going to get all that sort of code completion stuff. So as a starting point, what we'll do here is that when something is selected, we'll go ahead in our dispatcher and we're going to dispatch something. And the thing that we're going to maybe dispatch right now, and it doesn't much matter, right? But we'll do, I guess, answered. I mean, it wouldn't have mattered too much as long as I typed it right or wrong again later. All right, and so in this case here, what we really want to do is maybe instead of doing a score, we want to explain what the delta is, which is this, right? What was the delta on this particular change from one to the next one? Okay, so now we're dispatching a delta. And so that means things aren't going to work locally very well anymore, but we actually will dispatch a delta. I'm going to go up a level now for a moment to this page, and we haven't looked at this yet, but all it really is that we have another Svelte component that's importing that component right now, okay? And you'll notice on the top, it's just an import statement, which, by the way, is really, really powerful, because since it's just an import statement, it also means I can use a dynamic import statement. Since I can use a dynamic import statement, Svelte actually makes it really, really easy to do lazy loaded components, because I can take anything and actually listen to a promise and render once the promise shows up. That's super powerful. It makes things really, really smooth, because doing lazy loading is a couple seconds to be able to make things work kind of any way you want to, whether they're in your project or not, as long as you can load them from somewhere. Okay, so now because I did that, I will see there's an unanswered that I can actually load from here. So in our unanswered, we can actually provide a function for that thing. And the function here is, I guess we'll call this one handle answer. That'll work for me. Won't if my W doesn't work. Okay, so back in here in our script tag, we'll go ahead and we'll do handle answered. And in here, we're going to do this, and this is going to take an event. And down here, we will do this. And we're going to kind of blow through this really quickly, because I want to show you just a little bit more of the Sveltekit stuff. So we can get a detail object out of our event, and our detail object itself is actually going to have our nice little delta property. Okay. So in here now, we up at this level actually have a delta property, and that allows us to do a lot of interesting things, because this gives us the ability to declare a store. And a store is just a subscribable sort of thing that can hold on to data. But interestingly, on the side effect of anything that happens to the data, I can do stuff. So I could persist it to local storage. I could do kind of anything I wanted to, because it's just a store. All right. There's two types of main stores. In our world, there are writable stores and there are readable stores. I'm going to let you go ahead and figure out what the difference is between those without any help from me. So in this case, we're going to say that we have a writable store and we provided some initial value as a starting point. Okay. Now, if we were going to keep going, I might get this initial value out of local storage. I might do something else, but it's fine. So we'll get an initial value from our writable store. Now, really quickly, the moment we have this, you'll see that this is the type of thing which has a subscribe method. And this is super important, because a subscribe method is the type of thing in JavaScript that I can subscribe onto. But Svelte has a trick too, which is that anytime that I have something that is subscribable, I can actually use it with a $sign in front of it, and that means auto subscribe. So it will subscribe to it on the view and unsubscribe from it when the view goes away, but it's really just basically subscribing and unsubscribing to that given piece. And again, since those things can be anything, not just necessarily not just necessarily our objects here, but could be any type of object whatsoever, that can be really powerful, right? Okay, so we have a writable store. I won't draw the subscribe method to it right now, but we could use that to do some updates. But what we could do in here is that we can just find the conditions under which we do an update. And this should look really familiar to anybody who's written a reducer, because it takes the current score, and we're going to take this current and add the delta to it, and that's how we update a store. Okay, so we're going to do a version of it. Now, right now, it's kind of complaining because it's like, wait a minute, this is like writable and what the hell are you doing? And this doesn't make any sense. And that's all completely fair because of the fact that if I go back here, I've defined this as a 0, and it's pretty aware that that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Okay, so we can have a score here, which is viable and is in fact a store. And in our view here, we would subscribe to it by saying $score. Okay, so we would have something that was a writable store now. In terms of what we're actually going on. Let me see this real quick. That's fine. We can get to all that later. Okay, so we now have the ability where we said, well, we handled answered, we would do an update, we would take a current, we would add a delta to it. All that would make sense. It's not assignable to type never. Well, yeah, because that doesn't make sense. What are you talking about? Seriously. And all that comes down to the fact that I need to tell it that I can actually pass in a variable, because up until that point in time, everything was self-contained. Nothing was available from the outside world. But now that that's there, I can have a score from the outside world, which when I dispatch something is going to update a store which could be shared. That store update will be reactively updated and passed back down in the question, and then we should get the result down in here. So if I did most of that right, this will still work, and it does, which is kind of cool. Good. And we actually have that. All right, so let's take our last 10 minutes or so here, and let's talk about how we actually pivot and what we've talked about with SvelteKit, okay? You'll actually notice that in this part, I was in a page called page.svelte. And that's because of the fact that where SvelteKit shines is when we want to suddenly take this and apply it to a data set. In other words, when I want to use this component for every combination of some URL in the world, that's when we begin to get into the sort of SvelteKit piece of things that go back and forth. So let's look at this thing for reals, if you will, in type of this piece. So in here in the original app, you'll actually see that I've got a couple things. I have up here in the URL, which is going to be hard to see, I apologize, but it'll be say learn wines direct by sweetness level, okay? It's also what I call Joe, sweetness level. So over here, we'll see that in our world of SvelteKit, we actually have source and routes. SvelteKit is a file-based router, okay? It defines all routes by the way that you set up the file system, period, okay? At least by the default router. There are different things you can do. Any variable, so one of the things we've been working from so far was this test route, which is here because there was a test, okay? Anything, though, that in a parenthesis is just a grouping, doesn't really show up in the URL, but it's a logical grouping. Joe? Yes, you are now about to see the part that it only gets worse, buddy. It only gets worse. Well, wait, because it does get worse, if it wasn't clear yet, because it does get... Go all the way, buddy. All right, so yeah, when we get into all of these things, we'll start seeing that the slugs and all of the parts that are here are part of our folder names, okay? Parentheses are logical groupings, but they don't necessarily have any appearance in the URL. Square brackets are things that are actually replaced in the URL or are grabbed from a URL position, okay? So actually looking at what we were just there, we had the URL said learn, so that's why we're in our learn folder. Then there's this part here that says authenticated. That's just a grouping for me. That doesn't actually appear in the URL at all. Then there's a wines folder, which you can see in here. And then we get this, okay? Now, the interesting part about all this is that there's a structure and an imposed structure to the way that SvelteKit works. And the folder names are limited compared to how much it irritates me. It's having 3,715 files that all start with plus page that actually drive me crazy. What you'll very quickly figure out in VS Code is that you have to start using names in the full way, because everything is basically named the same, okay? But there's this nested hierarchy where you have layouts. Layouts are effectively the sorts of thing that provide the chrome, the structure of how things look. Whereas pages are supposed to be the individual part that's rendered, which can hold on to components and more things. All these things nest inside of each other, and they, to a certain extent, feed data into each other as they're running. So this is similar to a lot of server or static site generation languages, whether it's 11D or any of the other ones that are out there. They kind of do the same thing. So at the end of the day, though, what I wanted to show you was this, which is that you can get a lot of files in these folders, but they all apply to sorts of different things. So we have our Svelte file, which is basically what our page looks like. In this case, I have something called page.server. And by saying page.server, I quite literally meant that this is the type of thing that I absolutely need you to run on the server. I'm telling it that. If I would have just called that page .ts, it would have actually figured out for itself whether it felt that that could have been run on the server or run on a client, okay, in terms of where it went. The layout, again, being an umbrella sort of layout that works through it. Server.ts basically being a backend sort of function. So you'll notice these are mixed together, but you'll see if I go into things like server here, that these are the sorts of, oh, that does not help me. These are, oh, that didn't help either, really. Okay, these are the types of things that are saying, hey, at that path, I want to have a get. So I am making effectively a REST endpoint that lives at this path that's going to do some work. And in fact, in these particular cases, all it's really doing is building out that thing we were just seeing. So there's a get URL at that path that's going to take some data and it's going to do some queries and it's going to build out that structure and it's going to send it to the page. So the page itself is pretty much just saying, I'm going to get some data from the server when I render, okay? And that rendering that happened could be ahead of time, could be runtime. So what you can really think about that in the terms is that when something's server-side rendered, if it is sufficiently static, it can be rendered entirely on the server, or potentially partially in some future, but on the server. Or it could be that the static portion is rendered and then we hydrate the portions that are dynamic. Or we could actually say this thing, and you can do this per route, that this thing is entirely static and I know it, so go ahead and pre-render it as though it's just static content. Don't even bother to do any sorts of dynamic rendering. Or I could say, this is entirely the sort of thing that is completely dynamic. Don't touch it on the server side. It has to be here. So I can choose that per route as it's going on, but basically these routes interact with each other in order to do things. So this sort of question that we saw here a moment ago is the sort of thing where we do something like have this thing I call the learn store, and you've seen these sorts of um, uh, dynamic expressions. But really, what this thing did was said, okay, well, when somebody comes here, I'm going to do this thing called get question data, which was really, I'm just going to fetch, do a get request to this server file that exists in this current directory, pass it some information in. I'm going to await the response. That question data is going to be used to render the UI. I'm going to show that question. I'm going to show this little progress chart that you were seeing there and some buttons. And then I'm going to, when an answer is selected, get that delta, potentially update my store with some data and go on. In this case, that store is actually ends up, because it's just a function with a subscribe, that store ends up being updated on the server. So as somebody is going on, it's just kicking off small little messages to the server and updating data and keeping it reactive, but that sort of thing is transparent to what's actually happening. So the idea behind all of these Svelte functions is that you're building progressively a UI up of the layout and the individual pages that need to go into each other. The logic and the hard part is understanding this structure. And you know, like we're only like half kind of joking around with it, but as you can imagine, if you keep opening all these files up, pretty soon you have something that looks like that, and it's really easy to figure out which one is which when you're going through and trying to figure it out. So that's a criticism of something that I find difficult to work with. But the overall ability to throw something on here and say like, oh yeah, well, actually in this case, I've got this little load function, which is going to load up front. And before this page loads, it's going to go get this data for me, and that's going to happen. But I also have these sort of dynamic REST endpoints, and I can kind of localize them to the data that they're at and be able to do things in. It's actually pretty slick in terms of what's actually going to happen and do things. Same thing for posts for any sorts of things. As you saw, I had to get there, but we can do the same thing with sort of post endpoints. We can localize them. We can keep things there. We can exchange data back and forth and be able to keep things relatively local and self-contained in a lot of ways. Like you can kind of find where things are. I feel it's slightly advantageous over having like some giant server REST endpoint where it's trying to map where that's at. It is nice for this type of site to have things be relatively local. The flip side is anytime you distribute things into a million small little files, well, it takes finding those million small little files in the right one when you need to do things. Yep. Yep. It is not prescribed. It is one of the options, but you'll see an increasing number of things being kind of directed that way. In fact, they made a change in one of the later Svelte kits to say, how do we do intentionally resolution when we actually have, for instance, gets here or not in the same folder? So it's not prescribed. It is certainly available. They have always prescribed it or often prescribed it for form posts where you'll see that they actually put the post data in there, and they've now basically allowed it more for get requests. I think to me, uh, it makes a bit of sense because of the fact that the way it is choosing to do this is based on how you're asking for the get. So if you're asking for a get for application JSON, it goes to the get endpoint. If you're asking for HTML content, it actually renders this, which if you go back to how REST was originally defined is basically what REST was supposed to do. You have something at a URL, you ask for it in a certain way, and it gives it to you. So in this case, what you're really saying is, here is the backing data if you were just to give it to me. Here's what the rendered UI if I ask at the same location. So I think it's at best controversial, but I can get behind a certain amount of the reasoning. Is that fair? Okay.
I said it kind of delays instead of saying, well, it's on this server somewhere, go find it and bring it.
Right.
Instead of saying, okay, well, I'm gonna need that in 5 minutes. It's over there.
It's over there and it's here. And that's how kind of everything is going, is that in general, and you can control a lot of this through server caching and other things. But in general, even if you see me clicking around here, and some more of it may be loaded at this point, but as I was going through here, you may actually see a small lag on some of them because it's rendering and actually getting the data for those pages for the very first time when I'm hitting them at those moments as I'm going through. It's actually fairly slick considering if you realize that it's parsing this all from Markdown, doing all this work and rendering the HTML. It's a pretty cool thing in the background of what's actually happening. But yeah, that's kind of the basis. So this is now all SvelteKit and Svelte. I'm actually very interested to see because previously this was all almost completely server-side pre-rendered. I'd be very curious to see what it looks like in terms of differences in CPU cycles and how much things I'm using and like if what my terrible net loss has been for adopting a new technology. But those will be the interesting things that will go along as we kind of move forward into this. So yeah, this is a bit of it. And again, I know that was a super quick overview of things, but I think the most important thing to understand is Svelte is the component side framework, which is basically a series of how we create JavaScript applications and pieces of JavaScript applications. And I say pieces because it's very easy to say, I would like this thing to be a component, which I'm going to use in some other app that has nothing to do with Svelte. So pieces of applications or applications that are completely client side. Then when we get to SvelteKit, what we're really saying is, hey, let's use some of that same Svelte syntax with some additional logic and some more constructs. And then we can sort of dynamically decide what pieces really need to be client, what pieces need to be server. And in a perfect world, get a good balance of what actually needed to execute on server and client based on a lot of rules that in theory can be tuned over time. And I think that's intriguing, especially if they provide more insight into those rules over time. Right now, they're relatively static options. But over time, if those sorts of tweaks and rules and lengths of time and when I want to regenerate something are all available to a user, I could do some really powerful things with that. Because it's basically at that point could be thought of as a completely incrementally compiled application that's delivered as we go on and produced just in time for the user as they're going, always caching whatever has been static with the minimal amount of a portion of it regenerated dynamically as need be. And that's intriguing as a site gets bigger. Last thing, because I said last thing a couple times. Even though you can't tell the difference once you're in here, what's really happening is that some of this is actually completely client side and some of this is server side right now. So that was probably a server side route change. This was probably a client side route change. But what happens is when their client side route changes, they're actually acting like a single page application and it's just not showing you that part. And when it goes back to the server for something, it's acting more like a traditional web app. But the interesting part is that it's fairly transparent which one it is. And oftentimes it's based on number of calls and much other things. But I think that's a really intriguing part of what's happening. All right. Yes.
I had a question.
About the wine or the? No. Okay.
Is it actually maintaining state then? Is it actually hard to refresh?
When it actually goes from the server, it's making just another GET request to the server if it's doing a full reload of something, right? But for the incremental SPA version of it, if it believes it can maintain context, it's just changing out and swapping out pieces of it. But the interesting part about that is that it's actually the framework making some of those decisions, not necessarily you in this context.
Have you noticed any
No, the most interesting one to me, really, just to go back, is one thing that's kind of crazy to realize, coming from a React world, is that this script block, right, executes once. By I mean is once, even if all the URLs change and you're feeding new content into it, this script block executed once. So everything that has to act differently as that changes isn't a rerun of this script block, because this is more like a component which is being fed data. That is the discrepancy. I guess my point is the discrepancies I've all found have been my fault in a misunderstanding of it so far. But that's a really hard fought lesson to get your head around in the beginning. Mm-hmm.
possibly be? My thing would be as an application or website gets bigger,
Right.
where are you eventually? You're eventually going to run into it.
Ideally, although the interesting part about what was being kind of said is like where that's happening is that the only parts that are actually active are the parts that kind of like React that we can see on the screen right now, which means you're not really updating a whole bunch of subscriptions all over the site. You're updating the ones that are actually visible and seen and are doing something in scope. So that definitely has a different flavor to it, as to how things go. It's intriguing. Look, I jumped into this because I wanted to learn what they were doing and why. And the evolution of this was that they worked heavily on Svelte. Then they've taken this pretty big piece and they've worked on Sveltekit for a long time. And part of that was because Vercel and some others are sponsoring, and this is all kind of like there's a zero lift version of how to get this to Vercel, etc. But now I take it you don't like it. It gets even worse if you read the reasoning behind it. But the next part of it is that now, at least for the next version, they're back and trying to work on the Svelte side of it again. So there's kind of this go back and forth. I would say at this point in time, I would feel fairly comfortable with decent production stuff of working on Sveltekit, but there are definitely some things you have to get your head around, and it is a much easier job still to share libraries in the React world than it is in the Svelte and Sveltekit world. With Svelte, it's not too hard. With Sveltekit, it's terribly hard, because reasonably hard, because since some things run on the server and some things run on the client, your libraries that you're using, these npm libs, almost need to be able to do the same thing. You don't really know where that code's going to run. And that puts a lot of onus on a bunch of JavaScript libraries, some of which were written many, many years ago before anyone thought of this stuff, to have done the right thing. And I don't know about any of you, but I've met a lot of people in the JavaScript community. So yeah. So there you go. Clearly it's fine. All right, so anyway, there's the 2 seconds of it. Maybe at some point in the future, we'll do a deep dive on like individual compiler parts, because some of the real fun parts happen when you can hook into the compiler. Because I was telling Joe earlier, I'm a compiler guy. You give me something that's compiled, and I am all about it. I am in the middle of it. So there's all kinds of cool stuff you can do. But this will kind of give you a little bit of a sense, the top level of the difference between them. But it took me a few months to learn it. I crammed what I could in an hour. There you go. All right. No, you're all right. Good. It's a really good question. It's actually quite easy, 96.5% of the time. However, what actually happens, and some of you may have seen as I was going through here, there's this directory up here called Sveltekit. And what's actually happening is that Svelte's general premise is rather than have you write static types for everything, you should be able to infer a lot of the types, but have hard or concrete, actually, we'll just call it strong typing between these different pages, which are trying to talk to each other, but without you having to manually declare every type. And it does that by looking at one of them and generating the types based on what you meant, and then using that generated version on another. So rarely. You can get things crazily out of sync. That goes back to that refactoring I mentioned. I've had it refactor things where it decided to like change the directory it was getting types from. But most of the time, it's pretty good now. It rebuilds on a restart. So worst case, every once in a while, if you do something large, you have to restart it. But I would say in the high 90s now, unlike the previous versions, it keeps things in track. And where that really comes to bear, and we didn't see it a lot here, but just to kind of everyone understands, is that if I'm calling some get method or something that returns a JSON structure, when I go to the view, just like you saw me when I was doing data dot in there, I can do that even though I'm calling some get method, and it has automatically understood what the types were that were returned from that get when I got there. It's very cool. It keeps things very much in sync, except for that 3.5% of the time. Yep. Yeah, and that's how I feel about it too, right? All right, cool. Thank you, everyone.